Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. President, Mr. B. Ramulu, Mr. B. Shri Ramulu. I'm sorry, I'm not good at the South Indian names. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a pleasure and privilege to be here this evening and speaking to you on a subject which is increasingly becoming very popular and is inviting a lot of interest amongst the industry and business community of late. This is a subject which encompasses a very broad spectrum of issues relating to international trade, and in India lately has become very popular and to use a modern jargon, an in thing to be discussed in various professional organizations. I am familiar with the fact that you have just heard a lecture and a very interesting at that, and another lecture imposition will not be very conducive to your evening. So I'm trying to keep it as short as possible. I think a discussion on FTA is better served if there are more questions and answers than a monologue or a unilateral conversation. Nevertheless, I recognize the diversity of this gathering, and recognizing that, I think it will be worthwhile for me to dwell upon some aspects of free trade agreements and the context in which free trade agreements need to be seen for you to be able to better appreciate the subject. In the last few years, particularly since 2009 or 10, and more particularly after 2014, the subject of free trade agreements came in for a very heavy controversial discussion, particularly driven from a perspective of development which has very adversely impacted India's economy. My take on this is that this was a completely uninformed perspective, largely driven by lobbies and by political establishments which saw a certain kind of flow of support for the manner in which they would like to see India's industry and businesses grow. And therefore my task today would be primarily to speak about why free trade agreements are important, why they are relevant, and how India should proceed forward with its ambition of, whether you call it 5 trillion economy or whether you call it 7 trillion economy, 10 trillion economy. Different estimates have been presented by different government representatives from time to time. The one which officially I know is 5 trillion economy by 1925. So, and I think now it has been extended to 1930 or something, but I am very confused. So I don't want to dwell upon that. The limited point is to what extent a certain policy perspective or policy approach helps us in achieving our developmental goals. I think that is what is important. Everything else is subordinate to this consideration. Now, as we know very well, that we are going through extremely challenging times. I saw one of the slides which was being presented, which appeared to be very rosy, particularly in the context of offtake of bank loans and so on and so forth. But if you read expert opinions coming day in, day out, we are in for some terrible times. Global economy was already slowing down when COVID came, and COVID simply hastened the whole process. But while hastening that process, several positive offshoots came out of COVID. We are all familiar with them, and I will dwell upon that shortly. And after COVID, even while we are trying to get out of the pandemic impact, We have the Russia-Ukraine war, which refuses to die down. On the contrary, the signal is that this will go on, and not merely go on, but may very seriously impact global economic relations. God forbid global security relations, but definitely the impact will be felt on global economy. The American economy is significantly slowing down. Inflation has risen very prominently. American interest rates have never been as high as they are today, and in such a short duration, the kind of increase that Federal Reserve has shown. The European Central Bank has also increased rates. European economy is in complete tatters, and the UK economy is particularly in an extremely challenging and terrible situation. In this scenario, and if you look at eastwards, the Chinese economy, we'll get to know very little about it, but Chinese economy is definitely in doldrums. It's slowing down, but as they say, an elephant, howsoever you squeeze it, it will never become an ant. So the reserves, the kind of flows of currency that China enjoys, and the kind of dominance China has in the area of goods manufacturing and even in services, will never let it go to an extent where it will become an extremely negative economy. So every which way you look at globally, economies are slowing down, and particularly the energy economy is so badly impacted. And energy, as we know very well, drives the economy, the rest of the economy. And therefore, it will not be surprising, and forecasts are already being made. World Bank has already brought the estimates in relation to global trade. The World Trade Organization has brought the estimates to global trade further down. And specifically in the context of India, the manner in which Indian economy has to grow over the next few years seems to be quite a challenge. But having said that, it also remains a point that India seems to be the only sweet spot at the moment in the global economy. And therefore, the big point for us, the big take for us is, how do we get encouraged by this sweet position that India enjoys because of the manner in which the geopolitics is developing. And I don't want to dwell upon the geopolitics because that will take too much time. But we understand very well, particularly 2 or 3 aspects. One aspect is that you are familiar that today's trade and today's production systems, and I don't have to tell this gathering about the whole concept of the global value chains and the regional value chains as to what the concept is, but I need to emphasize one specific aspect, and that will be relevant for all of us, and I'll come to that. And it is important in the context of free trade agreements, and therefore I must emphasize it. As you know very well, almost every global value chain in the industrial sector, some way or the other during the course of its journey, traveled through China. There is no product in the world, whether it is manufactured by a multinational company or whether it is made by a small company somewhere in Asia, something or the other in a larger industrial product has been manufactured in China. And that is the kind of control that China has over global economy. In the process, China may be contributing just about 10% of value to that product, but it enjoys a position where that 10% part of the product is most efficiently made by China, and therefore there is no alternative. But since 2016, when Donald Trump came to power in US, this whole dimension of the trade conflict between China and the US started, and I don't want to go deeper into that because of time constraint. The limited point there was that China turned out to be a technology challenge to the US. And as long as it was simply China's contribution to the concept of offshoring, that is manufacturing away from your place of consumption, As long as China was contributing to that, and as long as the China contributes to that, it was fine. Nobody was challenging offshoring, nobody was challenging China, because everyone was benefiting from it. All American multinationals had place of production in China. But the problem arose when China became a technology challenge. And that is where security, espionage, and technology, particularly in the digital sphere, the future technologies, the whole gamut of digital technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on and so forth, cyber technologies and so on, the space technologies. And the moment the Americans realized that now that was where it could not go further. And that is when the whole gamut of policy responses came from the US. It is not as if offshoring was not already adversely impacting America. We are aware that after 2008, when the financial crisis hit the world, globalization had gone into a slow gear because the implications of globalization, particularly in the larger economies like the American and the European economies, was not extremely, but reasonably, or not reasonably, but significantly adverse. The lower middle classes and the middle classes in these countries had not grown. The working class had not grown for 10 years. Their real income had not grown. That was the kind of challenge. So globalization was already under challenge, but the trade conflict emerged thereafter, driven by the aspect of technology, theft, and so on and so forth. And that is when the lines were clearly drawn. If you recall, trade agreements are something which also reflect the failure of the World Trade Organization. Now, World Trade Organization was something, the WTO was something which was conceived at a time when we were living in a unipolar world. Whatever the Americans wanted, the world responded to that. Whether it was Asian economies, the production systems were linear. America was the repository of intellectual property, and the Asian countries were the repositories of physical production systems. And that is how the relationship continued. But after this whole gamut of technology, intelligence, security, and consequent politics came up, this whole equation has changed. And the failure of World Trade Organization is reflection of this evolution which has been happening over the last 10 years. Now, in a trading economy, and there are about 40 trading economies in the world, and we know the US, the Latin American countries, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, a few European economies, and a large number of Asian economies, the ASEAN and so on. It's about 40 countries which largely depend upon trade. India is one of them, but India's share in the global trade is just about 1.5%. So, looking at the fact that China today contributes about 17%, 13 or 14% to the world trade, India has a huge potential ahead. But the problem is that India has never been able to very concretely define its trade policy. Because India's trade policy has largely been construed as a process of incentivizing manufacturers and traders. The focus has never been on competitiveness. It's always been, and if you recall, before the 2015 trade policy, the present one, the 2015-20, and thereafter year by year, 6 months by 6 months, it is extending, and it has been again extended for another 6 months. So, before the 2015 trade policy, the trade policy was nothing but a sheaf of document which was only giving rates at which incentives will be given for different products to the exporters. Now, I am sure you will agree with me that that cannot be a trade policy. A policy without vision cannot be a trade policy. And unfortunately, India never had a vision on trade. In 1991, we started with opening up the economy. And since 91 to 2000, or let's say about 1995, and to some extent up to 2000, we were unshackling the economy from one control to another control to the third control and the fourth control and so on and so forth. We became members of the WTO in 1995, 94, we are the founding members. And 95 to 2001 was again a process of unshackling. 2001, China became a member of the WTO and the whole spectrum of international trade changed thereafter. But unfortunately, India never changed its approach to trade. It remained restrictive, it remained defensive, it remained negative, despite the fact that even to begin with, we had an extraordinary sectoral profile where our labor-intensive industry was very well connected with the global economy and had the potential of growing in the global market. So whatever with the momentum of the particular sector like textile, which is abundantly represented here, those sectors kept on growing. But those sectors were growing largely because of the momentum created in the sector itself, aided by the incentives which came later. Trade policy cannot be seen divorced from industrial policy. And I hope you understand what I mean. I mean, you cannot simply say that I will give X incentive to a product. You have to say as to how do you produce a product. And whatever are the bottlenecks in producing that a product, I will try and remove those bottlenecks so that my cost of production comes cheaper. I am referring to competitiveness, and I am giving this background because when I explain to you free trade agreement, you will recognize the importance. We have never looked at that. Even today, in the earlier presentation, I noticed the phrase GVC, the global value chains. Even till this date, our policies are not driven by global value chains. They are driven by product segments. Now, product segment can be this big, and there could be 100, 200, 500 tariff lines in that product segment. But you will be competitive only in 25, 30, 40. So there is no need as a policy for you to support or incentivize or facilitate you should, but incentivize and support the others. So we have never had this conscious approach. It was the 2015 policy which for the first time recognized the importance of global value chains. But unfortunately, despite 7 years, we have done little to operationalize that policy. And the criticism against free trade agreements, which was largely unread and unlearned, continued, primarily driven by domestic politico-economic lobbies. I am not saying that the earlier agreements have helped us in a big way, but certainly by having an agreement, you cannot have the operationalization of that agreement. I hope you understand. I mean, I can have a good agreement with, let's say, Japan, but if I don't do the necessary action for implementing that agreement, you cannot say that the agreement was wrong. Now, if you read the Korean agreement or the ASEAN agreement or the Japan agreement, the 3 agreements between 2005 to 2010, you will realize that there was a lot of action which India had to do. And all of that action lied in industrial policy. Trade policy was only facilitation. Because all the incentives which India was giving, about 90% of the trade incentives which India was giving was against law, against international law. And therefore and as you all must be knowing, that they were all challenged about a few years ago by the US, and we lost. It's only because the WTO dispute system is not working, so we have made an appeal and we are waiting for it, for the decision. So what I am saying is that the whole concept of value chains is something which was never institutionalized in India so far. On a firm basis, you may be doing that. On a firm basis, all of you represented here would be sourcing from A, selling to B, whatever. I mean, there is a value chain. But government or policy establishment has never looked at that value chain in order to unshackle it. So the first thing that is required is to give a value chain based attention to those product segments where we have a positive profile. Now, because foreign trade policy has not done that so far, and we are hoping that the new foreign trade policy which is being talked about will perhaps do that, FTAs come as a substitute for that. So I'm sorry for giving you all this background. I'll keep the time constraint in my mind. FTAs therefore are important to look at how they impact your industrial policy, how they help your industrial policy, and how they help in your integration in the value chains. If they cannot do that and remain standalone arrangements, where I make a product, I sell it outside, and that's it. But if I have an FTA arrangement where I know that, for example, if let us say textile, let us say garments is my core value chain concern. My policy should be such that right from the point of, if it is cotton, right from the point of cotton production to garment manufacturing, everything has to be facilitated in a manner, whether it is duty cuts, whether it is trade remedies, whether it is production support, whatever it is, all of it has to be supported or not supported or constraints removed. Unless we do that, it is not possible for us to grow forward. And FTAs to some extent can help you. Now there was a disillusionment in the initial years before the present government came, when the present government came, that FTAs necessarily adversely impacted India's economy. It was unstudied. FTAs may not have helped us in a very significant manner. But because we did not create the groundwork for that. Now, I leave it at that. Let me take the next point. Now, we have a series of FTAs. We have 13 FTAs the President mentioned about. These are FTAs of two generations. One FTAs are what have helped us in integrating in the region. That is the South Asian region. SAFTA, SAPTA, Indo-Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, India, Nepal. It's not a trade agreement but an agreement. India, Bhutan. Then, so this is one set of agreements. Here the objective is not to make major growth in our exports. But the major objective is to integrate the South Asian countries in our economy. Consequently, we get benefited because in South Asia, out of 8 countries, who is the best? We are the best. So we are bound to benefit. And that's what is happening. But while we benefit, we must also give market openings to others. Because otherwise, we are also getting some inputs. If Bangladesh has got a good market access in European Union for garments, it makes abundant sense for our fabric to go to Bangladesh and convert into garment. The problem is we have not made our fabric competitive because of many reasons, and you are better familiar with this. We can have a full lecture on that. So, because we did not do the industrial policy bit of it, we started saying that the FTA is bad. So, this is one set of FTAs. The other set of FTAs are 3 FTAs which have come for very acute criticism. These are Japan, Korea, and ASEAN. Now here again, ASEAN is necessarily an integration agreement. I mean, we all know very well that ASEAN perhaps is the most competitive region in the world. One of the most competitive region, and primarily because they are by themselves very small economies, and therefore it is necessary for them to enlarge their area of operation to make themselves competitive. Therefore, for them, export is an extremely important dimension of their economic policy. India has for too long had a perspective that domestic market is good enough for us. But that is not the right perspective in the modern system, because when you depend a lot on technology infusion, the costs go up, and if your scales are not big, your product competitiveness is impacted. And therefore, FTAs can help you there if you negotiate technology products in a manner that you become part of the free trade agreement, part of the value chain. So again, FTA has a very important role there. And Korea, Japan, and ASEAN were intended for this purpose. Unfortunately, they all happened at the time when the financial crash took place, 2008 and 10, and the global economy plummeted. And because the global economy plummeted, Indian economy got affected. Therefore, the larger blame came on those FTAs. The third set of FTAs are all under negotiations, and recently they have been concluded 3 agreements, one with UAE, the other with Mauritius, and the third a preliminary, what can be called as an early harvest agreement with Australia. UAE is what is called an entrepot economy. UAE by itself is not large enough for Indian industry to be able to sustain. But UAE is the hub. UAE can help us in getting into Africa. UAE can help us in getting into Central Asia. And UAE can help us into getting into into Europe. And therefore UAE agreement, in my opinion, is a very important and a very useful agreement. UAE, the average industrial tariff is 5%. And 99% of tariff lines UAE has agreed to bring down to 0 over a period of 5 years. I think 75% or 80% is at the initial stage. The agreement has come into force in August. And therefore UAE is a market which is right there waiting for us. And the prediction that the projection that we will become a 100 billion trading economy, the two of us, UAE and India, seems to be very achievable in the medium term. So UAE is a very important agreement. Australia is an early harvest. Australia, as you know, has 2 parts of their economy. One is what is called the primary economy, whether it is industrial raw material or whether it is agriculture. So it's primary economy, and the other part is the services economy, education particularly. Now in primary sector, we are already integrated with Australia in a significant manner. A lot of coal comes from Australia. Agricultural products, we haven't allowed Australian products to come in because we are scared that our dairy will be inundated, our wheat and other agricultural products will be badly affected, and so on. So therefore, in the first phase, in the early harvest phase, Australia has given us opening in their market. I'm not giving you the statistics because then statistics will tend to confuse, and if I start giving statistics, I think I'll take too long. So Australia primarily is a sweetener in the sense that they have given us a significant opening to begin with. But the real hard point has to come within 1 year. And that we are all ignoring. The political establishment is completely ignoring that. Everybody is saying, oh, we have an agreement with Australia. But what are the strong points of Australia? Dairy, wine, dairy products, agriculture, Now, all of these are extremely sensitive points for India. We are aware that it was dairy sector which, as a matter of fact, did not let India join the RCEP. We are also aware that it is the dairy sector which is coming in the way of India-EU agreement. And therefore, I really don't know how we will be in a position to conclude an Australia agreement within 1 year. But as of today, to begin with, Australia has given us a good opening there. It has signed with us certain mutual recognition agreements as far as education is concerned, and therefore the present level of understanding between the two countries is good. How we will negotiate the future, that time will only tell. The third agreement is Mauritius agreement, and there it's only about 650 products from India and about 370 products from Mauritius. It's a very small agreement, entirely being driven by the geopolitics. Mauritius is an Indian Ocean country. It is almost at the gate of Africa. It is an African country, and it is also at the gate of Africa. And for those who want to make investments in Africa, Mauritius is a great opportunity. Mauritius, in any case, because of the double taxation avoidance treaty, was a great, was one of the most important investing source for India. But now that that fiction has been healed up. But here, with this agreement, those of you who are interested in Africa, and I would strongly recommend that Africa is one kind of a region which we have completely, unfortunately, ignored. It is one region which is growing on a sustained basis. But because of our own racial prejudices and our understanding, and which is rightful understanding, that Africa is a very difficult country difficult region to operate. We have not ventured enough in Africa. India, as a government initiative, has also not done enough in terms of investments in infrastructure, in terms of investments in larger productive assets. For example, land is available in Africa to produce crops. And a country which is so heavily relying upon the food security dimension of its policy should explore the potential of African countries for producing grains, or for that matter anything. Raw materials, rare earths, they all come from Africa. Lithium we are talking about, sodium. So Africa has a great opportunity, and Mauritius agreement as of today to a limited extent, but once expanded in a large extent, can help us. The third set of FTAs are what are under negotiations, and about which have been under negotiations for quite some time, except the UK agreement, the India-UK agreement, which came into negotiation only when UK got out of European Union, and about which claims were made by the government in India as well as in UK that it will be concluded by Diwali. Now, I have had a fairly long experience in commerce, and I can assure you that no trade agreement can be negotiated in 4 months. Even Europeans who are very good at trade negotiations can conclude an agreement in 4 months. It's very difficult, particularly when very sensitive issues are involved. With UK, we have many sensitive issues, and that is something which came in the earlier presentation I noticed. Now these days, trade agreement does not mean agreement on goods alone. You don't just negotiate tariffs, that is import duties. You also negotiate market access for services. India is an important services giving country, and therefore services providing country, and therefore for India a market access facilitation in another economy is extremely important, and if FTA doesn't help you in that, then it's no use. And services related negotiations are very different from goods related negotiations, because in goods, if you bring down the tariff, market access is facilitated. In services, it's not tariff, it's not import duty, but it's the regulation, it's the regulatory system. And there, the two principles of what is called most favored nation and national treatment, these are individually negotiated. In goods, by the fact that I am a member of the WTO, I naturally have a most favored nation vis-a-vis any other country except Pakistan. There we have a conscious mention of it. In services, I have to consciously negotiate a most favored nation and national treatment. So just because I have an agreement with, let us say, Australia, doesn't mean that my doctor can go and practice there. My doctor can go and practice there only when I have negotiated a national treatment and mutual and most favored nation treatment clause in that agreement. And second, it can only happen when my qualification, MBBS, MD, whatever you have, is also recognized by Australia, and Australia's qualification has been recognized by me. So to that extent, getting a services related access becomes more difficult. The third thing which an FTA helps you is in facilitating investments. And there, as you would be aware, India at one point I think had about 60 odd investment treaties with countries. They were bilateral treaties of investment, and they basically, these investment treaties had two provisions. One was provisions for understanding, for agreeing on the basics, definitional, and what is called as promotion. And the other was investment security. We decided to do away with all of those treaties. So today we have none of those treaties in place, and therefore an FTA with an investment chapter helps us in restoring that provision to an extent, not to a full extent, but to some extent, because India is becoming an investor all over the world now, including even the developed countries, as you know very well. In Europe, in UK, in US, we have major investments. In Africa, we want to make big investments, in Central Asia, ASEAN, etc. And therefore, in an FTA, if investment-related provisions are negotiated, it helps us in both promoting our investment in those countries and then securing it. So FTA helps you in that also. Now, you may have a goods agreement, a goods-related provision, a services-related and investment-related provision, and these are all trade and investment-related provisions. But there is a completely new dimension of what is called the non-trade aspects of FTAs. And that is where the big challenge is. And that is why I said that you cannot complete a trade agreement, India cannot complete a trade agreement with any developed country in 4 months, for a simple reason. You have to negotiate provisions relating to environment. How environment is influencing industrial environment, how environment is impacting trade competitiveness. UK, when it goes for negotiating a trade agreement with any country, or European Union, let's talk of EU because EU is the precursor to everything. EU negotiates a trade and environment chapter with every country, every developing country. And Vietnam and Chile, two countries which are leaders in free trade agreements in the world, they all have with these developed countries an environment related chapter. And they have agreed to many of the provisions, some they have not agreed. But India is not yet ready for that. Because there is very little discourse in India, very little debate on these issues. On the one hand, we have agreed in the Paris Convention that climate change related targets will be achieved, the declaration, the disclosures will be achieved by 2070. But on the other hand, we have the track which we have made out for ourselves has not been synchronized with our economic track. See, you may decide that my emission will come down by 1% or 0.5% or whatever. But correspondingly, if my industry and trade have not structured or restructured themselves for that, there will be very little synchronization. And therefore, we are not prepared to commit to environmental targets. Labor. In the US-Mexico trade agreement, US-Mexico-Canada, the new trade agreement, there is a provision that if automobile sector in Mexico pays a wage of less than $16 to any worker, that particular company will not be able to export a car to US. So a minimum wage has been negotiated. For Mexico, it makes a lot of difference. For American companies, it makes a lot of difference because Ford and General Motors and everyone is manufacturing in Mexico. And if they pay less than $16, they can't export to US. India is apprehensive of the same sort of provisions. But then my take is that this is bound to happen, if not today, tomorrow. But that should not prevent us from negotiating a trade agreement in a tiered manner, in a step-by-step manner. Today you can agree to what you can do. And mind you, why we are having these trade agreements and why everybody wants to have a trade agreement? Because of a fast-growing middle-class market. So we have the market with us. And therefore, leveraging that market is extremely important for us. If we are giving opening to our market, we should negotiate these provisions. So if labor, I am not saying you agree on a minimum wage rate today, you should not. But have a step-by-step way so that by 10 years you reach the end point. Then digital economy. Any trade agreement today without adequate amount of understanding on digital economy is waste. And digital economy has two dimensions. One is digitalization of businesses or digitalization of production systems. And the other is the digital economy as a product. The e-commerce, the software, the SaaS and so on and so forth. Now in all of this, unfortunately, our own domestic regulatory system has not grown. You must be aware that there was a law under drafting, or not under drafting, but in Parliament on data privacy and data security. Unfortunately, that bill was withdrawn because there were a whole lot of challenges to that draft. So unless you have a domestic regulatory environment in the country on, let us say, e-commerce or anything to do with digital economy, how do you commit yourself? And therefore it is important that we produce that domestic environment, that domestic regulation today. Then only we can get into FTA. So I have just given you 3 examples, there can be many more. But environment, labor, digital economy, these are 3 major challenges. Other challenges, for example, are state enterprises, government companies. How to keep government companies taking more than the necessary advantage of government's regulations. How to regulate public procurement. So all of these are the new challenges. And that is why when somebody says that we can finish a trade agreement with Europe, EU or UK in 5-6 months, to my opinion, to my mind, it's just not possible. But having recognized that the multilateral trade system is more or less failing at the time, if global challenges continue to grow the way they are going today, multilateral system is not likely to move any forward for some more time. Though the Americans have come to the negotiating table on the dispute settlement system, which is under challenge, which is under a problem, it is very unlikely that WTO, which is a multilateral system, responds very slowly, as we have seen. And therefore, it is very unlikely that WTO will deliver some very path-breaking trade agreement in the next 2 years or 4 years. The last good agreement that it has given us is the Bali food security related agreement. So therefore, when WTO is not delivering, when trade conflicts are taking place, when geopolitics has changed, the focus has now moved to, instead of having long value chains, have smaller regional value chains in given areas, in given regions. And that is where the importance of FTAs once again comes in. It makes a lot of sense for India, for example, to have a trade agreement with ASEAN, because there is a lot of potential for value chain integration. Now we already have an ASEAN agreement, but we need to enhance it, we need to augment it. It makes sense for us to have trade agreements with African countries, because there the value chains are direct. A raw material comes, it gets converted in India and goes back again, or it goes to some other market. With Latin America, for example Chile, for example Peru, Brazil and so on. Central Asia, Eurasia. So we need to have trade agreements with these countries because the flow of value chain is in our favor. The present problem, unfortunately, is that we are being driven by two considerations. One, the geopolitical consideration of having a more political bias in the partners that we have chosen. I'm not saying that UK is wrong or Canada is wrong or any other trade. Yes, UK, EU, Canada. No, they are very, very good candidates for a trade agreement with India. Very good candidates. But we should not stop at that. We need to open new trade agreements, which is where we are not moving. And now with the challenges of global economy slowing down, it will become even more difficult for us to negotiate new trade agreements. It is in this context that we need to understand the role of a free trade agreement. It is useful, it helps in integrating markets, it is not a solution by itself, it only gives you a framework for better integration, but the action lies behind the trade agreement. And unless you do those domestic actions, you will not be in a position to take advantage of a trade agreement. I'll stop at this because I have already overshot. But if there are any questions, I would be very happy to respond. I could have been very specific, but I have deliberately avoided because then that becomes a very agreement-centric. For example, I can speak to you on UAE, but then some may be interested in UAE, some may not be interested in UAE. So that doesn't help everyone. I'm generally giving you a picture of UAE, but if anyone of trade agreements, but if you are specifically interested in a specific agreement, I can respond to that. Thank you so much.
I request Annamalai to come and go. Very confident. Very confident.
Friends, any clarifications or something we can seek from him? He is an expert person. Another ஒரு கஷ்டமான சப்ஜெக்ட், சாரி சார், ஐ யூஸ் எ லோக்கல் லாங்குவேஜ். ஒரு கஷ்டமான ஒரு சப்ஜெக்டை இவ்வளோ சிம்பிளாக சொல்லணும்னா சார், we salute you sir. The excellent manner you have explained this free trade agreement. Now I don't find any wonder that he has been the representative in the WTO representing India for a hard bargaining, and sir, you have an excellent skill of that submitting the factor, and probably the best choice India had you in the WTO. Very, very nice sir. Friends, any please, okay, yeah, please, yeah.
Good evening. Vice
I can hear you.
Come on.
Sir, first of all, it was very informative about everything. So when you are talking about FTAs, one thing I would like you to represent to the government, the labor laws are very complex. And the compliances are also very complex, sir. And financial cost is also very high. I think these three things, if not addressed, I don't think so we'll be competitive with China, sir. So that's my point. Thank you, sir.
No, this is an information, and I agree with him.
Yeah.
I agree with him.
Please be relevant with the subject.
Yeah, please.
This is related to the subject. We are talking about this incentive for the Indian tourism sector. We had in 2000 13%, later went up to 22%, again come down. whereas our neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, they have the duty exemption from European countries and North American countries. When we are cutting this incentive, naturally we are getting the less income. Simultaneously, they are getting the upper hand like a duty-free exemption. How we have to compete this? Number one. Number two, we are making a regional arrangement with the Asian countries and small people, some advantage we have, and we are giving and taking. And one sector, like you said, the North America, South America, the Central America, Latin America and South America, the Chinese, even the Singaporeans, they are penetrated too much with a lot of agreement with those countries. Why we are not going into those countries, sir? Can you please help us and explain?
Okay. If there is any other, I'll respond to both of these questions. This is one. If there is any other question?
No.
Okay.
Please.
I belong to the President of Council Building Manufacturers Association. Now newly we had a SIPA with UAE, comprehensive partnership agreement was there. That the agreement they are against the export. They have taken in the agreement what they say is 200 tons of gold can be imported, but Indian government they are giving the discount of 1% of the existing duty of that. It is not sufficient that it is not much attractive to the domestic market. So we want it to be represent to the government that it should be more attractive, because they are accepted to take our Indian jewelry with zero import. So we want to represent that also. And last month we went to Bangladesh. They are much far bigger into our improvement, our growth. But their import duty is 55% of the import value. So why Indian government are not trying to have a negotiation with Bangladesh government? Because I have seen the market, it's more potential is there, they want more Indian jewelry there. So is there any recommendation from the public or from like your experts to the government to convince the Bangladesh government? Thank you, sir.
I think we will have more interactions during the dinner. And
You want me to respond to this point?
Yeah, please, sir. Please.
Okay. The first, incentives on textile. See, this is exactly the point. We need to look at our production system and our trading minus the incentives. I'm coming to, don't get disappointed. I'm just the problem, this is exactly the problem. The problem is that right from 1991 onwards, we have only, see, there were compulsions of those days that we had to incentivize exports because we were not exporting. Their export was not possible. But thereafter, a string of Indian industry has become competitive. But people still want, either they want import duty protection or they want an export incentive. Forget about textile for a while. Automobile sector, and I'm sure there will be representatives here from that sector, we have 100% and 150% duties on cars, and we are the most competitive small car manufacturer in the world, and we have had 15 years of an automotive mission plan where we have protected the automotive sector. And by own confession of every automobile manufacturing company managing director, we are one of the most competitive countries as far as small cars are concerned. Is there a case for protection for us in the automobile sector? It's not. At least that's what I have been maintaining all these years. But because we have all got so used to these incentives, we don't want to let them go. Now answering your specific question, see, there is a difference. You look at Bangladesh is taking advantage out of a different system. Bangladesh is an LDC and there is a special arrangement between, because of that reason, and there is a GSP. India cannot have both those advantages. It's neither an LDC nor it has a going GSP on textile products. So now comparing, we cannot equate ourselves to Bangladesh. And in order to do that, to try and equate with Bangladesh through a legitimate route, we are negotiating an FTA. See, when you negotiate an FTA with EU and UK, you will obviously try to bring yourself at par with Bangladesh, because otherwise you have no advantage. See, today Bangladesh as a garment exporter has gone ahead of you. So the only advantage you will draw when you will negotiate the duty arrangement at the level where Bangladesh is. But then in the meanwhile, what should be done till that agreement is negotiated and concluded? We need to reduce our cost of manufacturing, which means the whole value, and this is a discussion which we were doing earlier in the day, the whole value chain has to be seen with a microscope, where all costs can be brought down, not just in the manufacturing system, but in the policy implementation system. For example, how import duties on raw material have been higher, making your product costlier in export market and therefore getting you out of that market. You have your yarn duties have gone because of the trade remedial measures, they are higher duties, and therefore you have to whatever you import on a higher price. Consequently, everything goes down at a higher price. So we in the meanwhile should try and look at these aspects till the agreements are negotiated. This is what I would like to say. The point on the point that you mentioned on, see, that is a point where I don't think I can answer, because India and UAE got into a negotiation. Clearly India was apprehensive that you are aware of the history of gold coming in from various places, and UAE also, the round tripping, the whole lot of, and I don't have to tell you all this. So therefore India has put that TRQ of 200 tons, and therefore a TRQ rate has been brought down. Now I think gold duty today is 10%? 15%. Now that is a problem. Despite 15%, gold is still coming.
So what do you do to the 15% is coming?
It's come down. But I think this is the reason for government to agree to negotiate a TRQ. So whether it is 1% reduction or 10% reduction, I think the problem perhaps needs to be sorted out in a different manner rather than simply this trade agreement related issues. We need to look at what gold is coming, how much is getting consumed, how much is getting used, how much is getting through invoices, how much is not through invoices, and so on and so forth. I mean, I am not getting into that territory, I am aware of all this.
Thank you so much,
So that is what it is.
Thank you so much, sir.